Well, thank you so much. It's unexpected that you'd have me at the very end of your session, so I'm very grateful for that. So you heard from Milda, who's my colleague at the university, on the first day of this forum, a bit about climate and coffee. And I know it's likely come up in your conversations since. So I'm just going to assume that this is sort of a known fact in our conversation already and go from there. And I'm going to hopefully bring this into some sort of an exciting place for what could be next as people that participate in the value chain for coffee. But adaptation to climate change is complex and it's urgent, we know that, and yet it's overwhelming. And it feels, for any one individual sort of looking at the numbers, untackleable. Like, how the heck am I gonna get at this? And just to sort of tell you a story, a little bit in brackets, so just put some parentheses on this story here. I was wondering to myself, like, why are they wanting me to come and talk at a coffee roasters forum? I was a little bit questioning that at first. And really what I study is transformation, adaptation to climate change as transformation. And then in the morning this morning, I stumble out of bed, and like most people, I take my phone off airplane and look to see what's come in. And there's an email from one of my other colleagues, and he's passing on a paper by physical scientists, not folks like us who've worked, in a more social way, but like a physical scientist. And it's an article that's just been released in some high journal. And the sum of this article is that physical scientists recommend that transformation is the only solution out of climate change. And I find myself like halfway across the living room just like, whoa. And I put my phone down, and I actually haven't even read the paper yet. I'm that sort of struck by what that is saying. So then it occurred to me, oh, this is kind of okay that I'm invited to the the ending talk of your Rosa's forum, because it's really important. And it is untackleable, but at least if we all feel that, then maybe we can come to some place with how to meet such a complex issue. So the invitation in this last half hour of our time together is that we broaden our perspective, shift our vantage point, and most of all, do what you do best as a roaster, but not just for roasting. In this case, do it for climate change adaptation for this industry. And I think what we just saw in Tim's presentation is exactly what I'm talking about. What makes, I sat in a boardroom of this really big corporation, and these coffee guys come in, and one of them's really into roasting, and the whole time we're in this board meeting talking about stuff, he's actually making a bit of geisha here and this other type and some other type, and handing out these cups of coffee for people to taste. And he's so excited. He's had a chance he's got passion, he's got innovation, he's experimenting. These are the sorts of things that you guys all know, because that's what you do. And I believe it's what we need to do, but for climate change adaptation in regards to coffee. So passion, experimentation, quick iterations. Oh, this plant got rust. Why? Oh, it wasn't getting enough of this particular nutrient. That's what you're doing. Roasting, there's a different set of iterations you might be doing, and quickly, right? Build on what's working, and more acknowledging that quality comes from source. So whether that's farmers, producers, producing regions. So I believe all these ingredients can be brought to bear on climate change. Are you guys with me on that? Okay, great. So let's just start with what you guys already know and go from there. So just to shift for a sec, you're all part of a global value chain. And I've worked with a few, and it's really interesting that the chains operate in a certain way. And let's just do another little moment here in this presentation to consider whether the value chain itself might be a vehicle through which we can start to get a little bit closer to adapting to climate change. So we'll do this as a thought experiment and see how it goes. But global value chains didn't always look the way it looks right now. Can someone just quickly tell me, like, give me a brief overview, like, what are the main roles that any value chain might look like that you are involved in? Like a producer.
Anyone? Importer? Huh? Mill?
The
What
mill.
else? Exporter? Importer? Roaster? Barista?
Consumer, right. So it didn't always look that way. And I wanted to just take us for a little bit of a journey back through history for a sec. Quite a long time ago, these systems of production looked more like a feudal system. So there was a lord or a landlord, and there were serfs that worked the land. There was no formal pay for their work, but they lived in the land and could cultivate their small parcel for some subsistence agriculture for their families. That was the way the production happened. Then there was a shift to a more sort of, I would call, colonial way of doing things. Basically, some king grabbed a bunch of land, started to farm it, and had a bunch of local people doing a lot of that work. So this is a cotton farm. And then it took a different form, and this is closer to what we're doing today, although I think a lot of what you guys are probably doing is a little bit a nuance of this, but something that's a bit more what I would call mechanistic, and mechanistic in the sense that it's really efficient. It's like, okay, we have inbound logistics, we have operations, we have outbound logistics, we have marketing and sales, we have some services, we have a consumer in the end. You know, and it's really efficient. That's why it's done so well, right? Would you guys agree this is sort of what is out there, whether it's Coca-Cola or whether it's iPhones or whether it's coffee. So there's a coffee value chain. So the question is, what's next? I mean, who's to say it's going to stay like this? And I really question that it would remotely stay like this. So, but what's next is really a question. So that's what I wanted to kind of play around in today related to climate change adaptation and linking it back a bit to what Milda was saying at the beginning of the forum. And I think to answer that question, or even to explore that question of what's next, we need to ask what is actually being asked of us, right? So if we could just keep using a mechanistic approach to how we do trade along a global value chain, then maybe we would keep doing it. But it looks to me like, and it probably looks to some of you like, there are some challenges on our doorstep. And as what Milda was really trying to emphasize in her talk is that we can't just think of coffee just as coffee, because it is related to people that are cultivating that coffee, and it's related to how the climate is impacting coffee. So already we're being asked to conceive of and work on a multidimensional task, right? So it's not just, perhaps it's gone beyond already the mechanistic way of thinking about production and consumption. So this is what Milda was saying on Friday morning, was that coffee, climate, and people need to be understood really as a complex and engaged like as a complex. So if you think of that, if we're being asked to conceive of coffee beyond coffee as climate and people as well, what could be next for value chains? So I wonder if the answer might be already in some of our experience. So this is a shade-grown coffee farm. An ecosystem is more like what we may need to move toward. And let me just play with this idea and see what you guys think. But in an ecosystem, and who's walked around on a shade-grown coffee farm? I imagine most of you. Is that right? Yeah. So every part in that ecosystem has a certain autonomy. It's doing its very thing. The nematode that was going around on the screen, it's doing its own part. But it's related to everything else. It's eating something, it's releasing potassium, is that right? For the plant. So every piece in it is both actor, and it's part, and it's also whole. It's also responsive. So an ecosystem, as you said, as soon as the plant is eating food, it puts out certain things, and it gauges other things to get its needs met, right? So there's this responsive connection between all of the parts. Dynamic, so it's creative, and it's iterating, as I'd said earlier. Participatory and alive. Like that's what we see when we see something like this. It's just life, right? So my suggestion to you is, what if we looked up from roasting, and we're still going to roast because that's what we do, right? That's what you do. That's what your part is in this ecosystem. But if we looked up and viewed the entire value chain as what we're working on instead of just our piece, does that make sense? There's three things I want to leave you with, and the first is viewing every part as, on the one hand, whole, but also related, meaning that adaptation is never going to be a single solution. There's not some expert out there who's going to say, this is what you need to do. That's not how it's going to be. And I think when we get overwhelmed and we think it's so untacklable, it's because we're building it off an assumption that's wrong. It's not going to be one person. It's not going to be one solution. It's going to be many little tiny hammers designed to hit many different nails. When I was in Guatemala, in the coffee sector that's sort of northeast of the capital city, one side of the valley had problems with rust, had really, devastating problems with the drought, so that their berries were not producing on the plants this year to a great extent, very sparse. On the other side of the valley, something else had happened, and those plants were doing all right. So it's really nuanced. What's that going to look like? And so if we can conceive of a value chain, so who you are related with on either side of that value chain, each person has something to offer. So how would the value chain work so that each player in it, each part of it, has something that it can bring, insights and innovations from all points of the value chain. So here's an example, and it's not the coffee sector, but I think it's related. In Costco Wholesale is the company that I was working with in the States. They have this really interesting policy where every person who enters their company has to work on the factory floor for, I think, something like 3 or 4 months before they move anywhere else. So even the top lawyer for the company has to work on the factory floor for a time. And it's their way of honoring that every part of the value chain, every part of the company has an insight to offer. And so somewhere along the line, they used to produce these nut containers in a cylindrical way. And somewhere along the line, someone from the factory floor was like, wait a second, why don't we make these square? And then more can fit on a pallet, which means that we can send more pallets in one go and actually reduce the amount of carbon emissions, because we're reducing the number of these containers that are having to leave whatever country. And so they reduce their carbon emissions simply by restructuring the shape of their container. And that insight is not from the boardroom. That's from someone who's like, hey, wait a sec. If we ran the math differently on the shape of this, it could be different. So that's what we're needing, but from all points of a coffee value chain. Does that make sense? So, and I'm not asking for you guys to find those solutions. I'm just asking for us to, it's almost like shifting your stance in your seat. Like, how could you conceive of how you do your part in a way that enables these innovations across the chain? It could just be a subtle shift. It could be a pronounced shift, but it's a vantage point change. Make sense? Okay. So number 2, the other thing that could arise if we conceive of a value chain as more of an ecosystem, we broaden our perspective to include the entire chain. And this is, it could be kind of self-evident. Maybe you guys are already doing it, but people tend to, and this is every human, is we just tend to do what we do, and we get kind of like focused on that. We put our blinders on. But I think what you guys particularly do in the value chain, because I've seen it, is this intrigue and really in the passion to really push the envelope and really be creative, I think could be fostered in other points of the chain. There's mastery happening here. So how could mastery happen at all points? And so that's these characteristics of what I feel you guys do really well is passion, a safe to fail experimentation. So how can you experiment in a safe to fail context? So Tim's trying things out on his farm. If he fails, it's okay. He's like, I'm going to succeed. I'm just going to keep going. How can we do that for the chain? So there's not some, if a farmer tries something out and it fails, how can the whole chain not penalize him for that? And how can the chain be like, great for trying, try something else? So, and I think that's going to have to come across the chain, not just from within each actor. So this is an example of one of the producers that I met in Mataquescuintla in Guatemala. And his farm is doing really well, despite a lot of challenges that this particular country and region has had. And we were asking him to show us his farm, and he knew every plant. Like he knew this plant. He turned over the leaf, and it's quite a big farm. Turned over the leaf and was like, yeah, this one has some rust, but this one doesn't. And he was right. So he knew it intimately, and he was trying things out. He was telling us all the different things he tried, the same way that Tim's describing. Why was he doing that? And the farmers around him weren't. What was permitting him to be experimenting? And so that's my question to you is, what are the ingredients for that? And how can we foster them across the value chain? Okay. And then number 3, so this is my last point, and I'm going to leave some time for questions as well. But how do we, if we're an ecosystem, how would we practice the dynamism and the recirculation that occurs in any ecosystem, right? So I don't even think it could be called a chain anymore, because it would be just way more dynamic than that. I know that some value chains, I feel them to be kind of like early adopters. They're the innovators. They're realizing that if they want their growth to increase, they're going to have to deal with their supply, which is actually dropping. And it's dropping for many reasons, one of which is climate change. So that cross point where what they're making from selling is going to hit this supply drop. Some of them are reconceiving of their value chains and starting to invest back into producing regions. And so I do think, recirculating wealth is definitely an important piece, because, this man in this picture here, he had resources. He happened to be an intermediary, so he was buying from all these different places and had the resources to put into his property. And so not every farmer has that. So, if there was a way to recirculate wealth back, that would definitely support the value chain being more open to experimentation and being more creative. But I also think it's really about recirculating and keeping our relationships really dynamic. And this comes from some work I did in other value chains, but connecting better, trusting each other, and building each other up. So it's not just a value chain based on transaction of like, I buy this, I give you that. It's not based on transaction, it's based on trust. And I think that is going to be a very different culture out of which we might find some solutions for climate change adaptation. So not just a value chain, but I've put this here as a trust chain. I don't even know. I'm not even sure if the word chain would be relevant, but some sense that we've got this. It's not you guys are going to suffer from drought, and yeah, we might not be able to sell as much, but like we got to get at this, and we got it. So that's the sense that I'm wanting to convey to you. And I think we're seeing this, and this is not coming out of just speculation. I think this is already starting to happen. Has anyone seen this shift in the character of how value chains, or how your value chain is working? A little bit. I've seen a few people nodding. Yeah. So, okay, wait, I just went a little fast here. So this is an example. This is the Brazil nut work I was doing in Bolivia and Peru so here we have, this is a buyer that sells to Costco. The woman on the far side, she does export in Lima. And the guy in the middle he works for Rainforest Alliance, so a conservation organization. And there was many others involved in this work, but they're holding up their new principles that they wanted to work with as a value chain. And this was after about 18 months of leadership development work with them, and the whole value chain had really shifted in how it did its business. It was no longer business as usual. It was quite a different ballgame. And so it's an example. We also worked with artichokes in Peru. But I asked the woman who exports, because she's familiar with so many value chains, and I interviewed her and I asked her, how does this value chain feel compared to others? And she just described what I was just referring to. Like it hardly is a chain. It's based on these deeper relationships, and there's trust. Even though trust is intangible, it's actually kind of like salt in a meal. Like if you don't have it, you notice. And if you do have it, it can be a tiny little bit, but it changes everything, right? So yeah, this is the example I had for that. Some of this is based on a fellow called Frédéric Laloux, if I'm pronouncing that right, he's French, a book called Reinventing Organizations. And so we have tried this out. He's doing this work more at an organizational scale, so organizational development. I've been playing with some of these concepts in a value chain context. And the idea, and I don't want to spend too long on this, I just thought I would give this to you to give you a sense that there's a lot more here. I'm throwing these ideas out like I thought of them a couple weeks ago, but there's way more. If you double click on this kind of thinking, there's a lot to be found. And so he's describing these ways that organizations have worked. And I was doing something similar with how value chains have worked. And what he's describing is this kind of way of operating as a group of individuals, whether you're an organization or whether you're organized as a value chain. But some of these notions of wholeness, self-management, and purpose are at the core of what he's talking about. And I think they apply for roasters within a value chain as well. Is like, what is your purpose? How do you conceive of the whole value chain as wholeness, not as my part only, but how does it relate as a greater dynamic whole? And then this notion of self-management is very specific what he means. He means that each part of more of an ecosystem style way of working is free and liberated to do its thing, whole and complete, even though it's in relationship. And there's way more trust as a result, because you're not micromanaging people around you. So I just want to make sure you guys had a sense of a little bit of where this is coming from. And here's the thing, is that if what Milda was saying around people, climate, and coffee, if we're going to do that, as I was saying, we have to shift our vantage point out of just coffee into three things now, and big things: people, climate, and coffee. And I suggest to you that one way to get at that is to actually shift the view of the value chain as an ecosystem rather than as a specific actor in a chain. And I think it would open up a whole new horizon of what might be possible, so that when we look at something like climate change, it's not quite so overwhelming, because we're not coming at it as an individual overwhelmed by something huge. We're coming at it as a group of individuals linked with organizations, linked through trust, operating in a dynamic, iterative, creative way. So that's what I wanted to say. I'm really open to some questions. I have time, I believe, even though we've run over. Could we take a couple questions? And
first of all,
look
let's
for
give a round of applause.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
You would almost think you've been here for 2 days listening to